So Intel have released their latest microcode update via a BIOS update through the motherboard partners in what they say will help with instability problems. But you guys have been messaging me behind the scenes in comment sections, Discord messages, telling me you want to have a video on this subject. I was gonna save it till next month, till I got back to Australia, but I just got flooded with messages. So today we are looking into this problem, and we have found some really scary information here. The deeper I dig with this whole situation, the more problems I see, and I do apologize in advance for the tone of my voice in today's video. I know it's not going to be pretty, and much like that time when JD Fortune got ejected from InXS. But straight away, my analysis has pretty much came down to one big problem with these CPUs, a huge problem, and that is the VDD CPU voltage. In other words, voltage direct. That's what VDD stands for. It is based on the CPU. It's also a sensor on the CPU that monitors, I guess, the max voltage that can come through the CPU and be provided to any component on that CPU. There is also the Vcore voltage, which is the motherboard's voltage sensor, and that's its own external sensor. However, in this case, I believe it is not as accurate as the VDD sensor, which is located on the CPU. Then lastly, there is VID voltage, as well as IMC voltage, VID standing for voltage identification. This is the voltage that your CPU cores request. They don't necessarily get that voltage all the time, but they request that voltage. And if there's a difference and they don't get enough voltage, then of course you can get instability problems that way too. However, all the aforementioned voltages are very important, especially the three that are located on the CPU. Though the VDD CPU voltage, this is extremely important because out of the box, whether we go back to the first BIOS iteration, which was on this system here, and by the way, this is I believe kind of a fresh 13900K that I haven't touched since I had the problems last year. So this CPU was in this system. This was the second variant I had of the 13900K back when I was having issues and I just wanted to try another CPU. This CPU on this motherboard had the initial iteration of BIOS on it. This was the 201 on the Taichi Carrera Z790, and this has the microcode called 10E on board. Now, the latest BIOS iteration is the 0x129 microcode revision. The one before that was the 0x125. Today, we've tested all three of these microcode revisions, and we've found some shocking results here. The first of being that the VDD CPU voltage is running out of spec on all three of these BIOSes, and even on the so-called safe baseline profile from Intel. Now, what is the safety limit from this VDD CPU voltage spec, you may ask? Well, it's 1.3 volt and under, and we can see this via changing the values in the BIOS themselves. When we go above 1.3 volt, this goes red. Now, the only reason this goes red is because ASRock have been advised from Intel that this is the setting where it should turn red, and then they've passed that information on to us via this red symbol in the BIOS when we start changing this value. It means it's dangerous. It means it's out of safety spec. And this has been going on for the life of motherboard tuning when you're in the BIOS and the text changes color. Now, in all circumstances, when we run these tests, and by the way, I have for this video disabled all the E cores because I don't believe the E cores are the problem here. I believe it's the P cores and the high speeds and the high voltages applied to these P cores. And so what we're seeing here with these P cores is every single time I run these tests, we're going with a CPU VDD up to 1.424 volt, which is way out of spec. It's way above that 1.3 volt that's recommended in the BIOS as the safety limit. Though there's so many other inconsistencies and problems that I came into, that today's going to be more like a journey than anything, and we'll talk all about it with benchmarks, gaming benchmarks, as well as Cinebench results, right after today's video sponsor.
If you want to get rid of this annoying activate Windows message, then today's video sponsor SCD Keys has you covered for as little as $15 US. After you enter that coupon code BFTYC, you can cop yourself a legit single end user license today. Also works for Windows 11 Pro too. Links in description below.
Welcome back to Tech Yes City. In this case, we have tested 5 different scenarios on the CPUs and the configurations here, and we've found some very concerning results. The first thing is the initial BIOS release gives out the best results in terms of not just performance in games, which we'll get onto right now, but also in terms of efficiency, which we'll get onto a little bit later. Let's take a look at 720p results here, because we are just going to absolutely weed out differences here. And what we've done here in today's video, we've set the memory speeds manually to 6,000 megahertz. Now you're probably like, Brian, that's way too low for memory speeds. These things can go much higher, 7,200 megahertz, etc. But on the flip side, I believe that's actually a big part of the problem. And I'm going to be recommending at the end of this video, you drop your memory speeds along with another voltage that we talked about earlier in the video. But let's get onto these results here. 6,000 megahertz memory, CL32, 720p Baldur's Gate 3. Now the baseline profile made zilch of a difference between the default profile versus manually setting in this baseline profile for games here. And in fact, the baseline profile on the X129 microcode revision scored clearly the worst versus all the other results here in today's video. And what was surprising is it even lost to a 5.2 gigahertz all-core on the initial 10E microcode revision. So there is a trend right from this first game here and the results that is starting to begin, and we'll talk about that a little bit later too. But let's get on to CS2 here, Counter-Strike 2, and what we got was, again, the same scenario. The 129 BIOS was performing the worst, both on the baseline profile and, again, the default profile out of the box, which both of these were performing pretty much identical. It didn't really make a difference. But then we go now to Cinebench, and here is where we were scoring the worst results, again, on these new baseline and default settings on X129. In other words, we were running hotter temperatures, we were running more wattage, and we were getting slightly inferior scores on these Cinebench results, to the point where my final test, I decided to lock 5.2 gigahertz manually in. And this is probably the most interesting of all the results that I saw here in relation to Cinebench. And here's where we were getting on the baseline profile at 5.2 gigahertz all cores versus the initial release BIOS. This is the 10E microcode revision versus this latest one. We were getting wattage that was going from 158 watts with VIDs of 1.27 volt, now going all the way up to 1.33 volt with 184 watts. And we're getting similar performance, although it was slightly higher on the initial BIOS revision. So on the contrary here, what we're seeing with these new microcode revisions is we're seeing increased voltages, which is leading to increased power consumption, increased wattage, all because I believe, looking at these results so far, the trend is that something may be degrading on these CPUs, so Intel's combating that via just giving it more juice at the same levels. But what I don't understand here is, why doesn't Intel release a proper baseline profile? Why don't they just say, okay, let's drop the all cores down to 5 gigahertz, drop it down to 1.3 volt on that VDD setting within the actual safety spec, and then drop down, say, your IMC voltage as well to 1.3 volt. And just say, look, don't take your memory speeds above 6,000 megahertz. Because the problem I was having here was, even on the initial BIOS release, and this is more information that we're going to dig into, was when I set 5.2 gigahertz all cores and even 5 gigahertz all cores, and I dropped that CPU VDD voltage down initially to 1.3 volt, my computer was just getting blue screens. It wouldn't boot. And I was scratching my head going, what's going on here? Why isn't it booting properly? But then I changed the IMC voltage to 1.3 volt manually. And so that was running higher at 1.4 volt as well. But then I remembered back in the day, there was certain voltages that you had to run at or below other voltages on the CPU. And clearly the IMC is one of those voltages that you have to run at or below the CPU's VDD voltage. And so once we did that, our computer then booted into Windows absolutely fine. And so for me personally, that confidently gives me all the information I need to know here. Intel basically has said, we're going to keep the advertised speeds for you guys. We're going to keep giving you those advertised speeds, but we're going to do so in a manner that's just increasing the power consumption, increasing the voltage over time, knowing very well that the CPUs will start to throttle. And here's the last benchmark we're going to show up, the CPU temperatures, which have also radically increased to the point where they're now thermal throttling on these later microcode revisions. And so we're going to keep doing this in hopes that our CPUs can just prolong their life and not have any instability issues. And I think they're just hoping until these things run out of warranty, they'll be in the clear, or when Core Ultra releases, it'll just wash everything away. But what you're getting here is just an inferior experience as time goes on. And I think they can't do a release where they say, hey, just disable all your E-cores, drop your speeds down to 5 gigahertz or 5.2 gigahertz, and drop the voltages to within what's actually safe from our own guidelines. I think they can't do that because they advertise much higher speeds on the box, and they'd be in a world of pain when it comes to the legal side of things. But I'm not a lawyer. This is one thing that I would love to get clarification on, is what are the legal ramifications of Intel if they were to actually give you a proper safety spec with these CPUs. And those VDD voltages were then running at 1.3 volt properly all day, every day, as well as all the other voltages were within a proper safety spec. What would be the ramifications of that? That's the one thing I can't tell you in today's video. But what I can tell you from today's results with this 13900K is that the CPUs initially were giving out better performance, and they had better voltages, much safer voltages too, than what's being used in these microcode revisions. And also you were getting, as a result of that, better performance. Whether my CPU was, with the P-cores, not throttling out of the box at 5.5 gigahertz all-core, but then it's throttling and using up much more power. And then at 5.2 gigahertz, it's also using up a lot more power. So at this stage, you may be asking me, what exactly do you think the problem is here with these Intel CPUs, 13th and 14th gen? And I think it goes back to what I was told over a year ago in terms of the input-output hub is now directly off the die. And when I did my research on this architecture, it was essentially a chiplet design that was then sort of brought into a monolithic design. It was a very unique design of a CPU. And I think somewhere along the lines, Intel lost control over certain elements of the CPU. And so for me personally, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense that dropping the VDD voltage then causes instability on booting issues. But then if you want to run higher memory speeds, you can't drop that VDD voltage, if you get what I'm saying. So I believe there's a problem here where perhaps the IMC voltage was directly linked to another component on the CPU, and that component does need much higher voltage. And over time, that's caused perhaps another part of the CPU to then degrade. And so Intel's then fixing it via just pumping even more voltage and heat in the hopes that the problem over time will just get washed away. And I know that's a crazy theory, but the results and the progress from Intel themselves and what I'm seeing here makes no sense whatsoever. There's not a safety profile here at all. Nothing's safe about these new settings. And in fact, they're much worse than the original settings that were released for consumers back in 2022. Anyhow, going forward, my personal recommendation would be with these CPUs, go back to the earliest BIOS revision that works stable for you, and then take the CPU cores down to 5.2 gigahertz manually, go to your VDD CPU voltage, drop that down to 1.3 volt, drop also your IMC voltage down to 1.3 volt, and then make sure your memory speeds are running at a level that is stable at that 1.3 volt IMC. So in this case, 6000 works fine. And if you've got, say, 7200 megahertz, you may wish to tune down the CL timings and tune down the memory speed down to 6000, or again, wherever that speed works at that said 1.3 voltage, I would recommend doing that. But also if you've got lower memory speeds, say 5600 megahertz, just leave it at that. It should work absolutely fine. If you raise those speeds, the memory itself might not be able to boot properly. So there's my recommendations there, on top of also disabling all your E-cores. Voila, that's an actual safety setting that I've just told you guys. Even though the performance might not be what you desired in terms of all-core Cinebench scores, We are getting much lower temperatures now, much better wattage, and also in games we're getting even better results than these new baseline profiles with the CPUs running at 5.5 gigahertz in games. So it's one big, just massive chicanery of fury coming out from Intel with these BIOS updates, and I don't believe they fix anything. I just believe they're prolonging the problem. And my results here today just show that this problem has not been fixed at all. I think there's going to be people still having instability issues after this microcode update, and also further microcode updates. It's just a sad trend to see. As the BIOS revisions have come along, you've just seen increased VIDs, you've seen increased power consumption, and worsening performance. But also the last question on your mind will be, well, AMD does this, right? AMD does this with Ryzen CPUs, especially some of those CPUs out of the box are getting aggressive voltages as well. They're going over 1.4 volt, etc. And the biggest difference between the Ryzen CPUs and the Intel CPUs is that the Ryzen CPUs use TSMC silicon. And what I can conclude from today's video is that the TSMC silicon is far superior than the Intel silicon, and so AMD just don't have clearly as many problems to deal with as Intel does with their silicon. Anyhow guys, with all that out of the way, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, then be sure to hit that like button. Also let us know in the comments section below, what are your experiences? If you've got one of these CPUs, what are your experiences with them? What settings have you been using? What odd and abnormalities have you been coming into? Would love reading your thoughts and opinions as always, as well as the comment section, just I guess working as a bit of a hub for people who are having problems. They can sort of talk to each other as well as try and get more answers. Love all that good stuff. Let's keep being a community, but at the same time, let's be very critical of Intel here. And they released, make no mistake, they're the ones that released this product, and they know exactly what the problem is, except they keep giving us this absolute crap that they're releasing, and they won't get to the real issue, because I don't think they want us to know the real issue here. And they know it. They're just stalling. They're clearly stalling with these BIOS updates. That's what I see here. And if you've got one of these CPUs and it's your main, I feel sorry, but again, Intel is the one responsible here. No one else, not the motherboard partners, not you or I. And also on that token, it's not our job to fix Intel's problems. We are paying them money. That's the product and service. We're paying them money. They're giving us a product that should just work fine. And the last thing I will go over before I get on out of here is, why not just bring back the old days of CPUs? Have it so you have these CPUs that have a lot of headroom for overclocking, and the enthusiasts can figure out all that stuff, but then the average guy, the person just buying a PC to play games on and do their stuff on, comes into zero issues. Can we bring that back, please? Because this is what I'm seeing is just a mountain of headaches, and it's headaches that I'm sure is coming back to bite Intel, all for the sake of chasing AMD on some benchmark charts. But also on that note, Intel, please start using better silicon. And with that aside, I'll catch you guys in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye. Also, editing this video back, I realized I missed out one part of testing that I did, but I forgot to talk about, and that was all core at 50 from 52 on the initial BIOS release, the 10E. What I noticed here was that the power difference between 5 and 5.2 was actually quite substantial, as well as the VID voltages that the CPU was requesting. In other words, after 5 gigahertz, these CPUs start to get really inefficient and they start dropping off big time. In other words, Intel knew that these CPUs were running way out of spec for far too long. And also further evidence of this is in the 5.8 gigahertz single core boost that I actually wasn't able to achieve out of the box on this initial BIOS revision. It would only go to 5.5 gigahertz. So Intel knew back then, back in 2022 with this 13900K, these things, they knew it. They were the maker of these CPUs. They know exactly how they perform and exactly how they scale. And so they've overvolted them out of safety spec for far too long, and now it's clearly coming back to play havoc with them. But the problem is, as we talked about before, is I believe their silicon is just not as good as TSMC. And so that is the biggest reason I think Intel's fell off in the competition with AMD here. But not just fell off, they've been derailed. But ironically, it wasn't by the competition, it was by their own hand.